Thank you so much for inviting me to become president of the association. It's truly a great honour, and I appreciate that I follow in the footsteps of many illustrious holders of the role. It's particularly poignant that as head of Cadw, I've been asked to take on the presidency as Cadw celebrates its 40th anniversary. So, as I considered what subject I might focus on, I thought it appropriate I should reflect on the way in which the great masonry monuments of Wales that now under the care of Cadw have been presented to the public over the last 100 years. During the course of the 20th century, the Ministry of Works and its predecessor, the Office of Works, brought an incredible 880 monuments, and the majority brought into state care an incredible 880 monuments, majority between 1913 and 1970s. It's been described as the greatest national collection of monuments and historic buildings ever assembled. When the Welsh team from the Ancient Monuments and Historic Buildings branch were moved into the Welsh office in 1978, to all intents and purposes, decisions on managing the 120 or so monuments in their care were now made in Cardiff, 20 years before formal devolution. In 1984, they were joined by a commercial team seconded from the Welsh Tourist Board to form Cadw. The gathering of the National Collection was quite literally a monumental exercise, and there can be no doubt that the exercise in bringing them together effectively saved many from further decay or even complete destruction and loss. However, the way they've been conserved and presented to the public has changed dramatically. Throughout the 20th century, or at least up until the 1980s, the fabric of the monument rules supreme, a concept that had its origins in the repair as found principle. From the 1980s onwards, we see a slow but significant change. In Wales, I suggest there have been several drivers for this change. A change in the approach to the philosophy of conservation, the rise of cultural tourism, and an increasing awareness of Welsh national identity linked to devolution. This presentation will consider the origins and longevity of the prevailing approach that has held sway for most of the 20th century and how this became manifest in the way in which the monuments of Wales were presented. I will then consider the drivers for change that took place at about the time that Cadw was formed, and using examples from the last 40 years show how this has led to significant change in the approach. For the purposes of today, I will focus on the great masonry monuments of the medieval period, principally the ruins of the great stone castles and abbeys of the 11th and 15th century. So starting with the Office of Works and approaches to conservation during the earlier part of the 20th century. Well, by the end of the 19th century, the majority of great masonry monuments of the medieval period in Wales were in an appalling condition. For example, here at Larne and Tintern. They're often held up by the ivy that enveloped them. Many owners on whose land they happened to sit were quite happy just to simply let them gradually collapse. The prevailing approach was benign neglect, perhaps influenced by the years of treating monuments as romantic ruins that had its origins in the prevailing artistic and intellectual romanticism movement of the 18th century. However, the general deteriorating state of the majority of the sites led to increasing demands to introduce legislation to provide protection. The first monuments to be given to protection were prehistoric sites, including here at Pentre Ifan, the first in Wales in 1884, exactly 140 years ago. A key moment in the approach to the protection and presentation of these sites was the appointment in 1910 of Charles Reed Peers as Inspector of Ancient Monuments and the creation of what was to become the Ancient Monuments Department of the Office of Works, and the acquisition of new monuments across Britain, including medieval masonry monuments, was to speed up rapidly. He was supported by Frank Baines as the Senior Officer for Works. Soon after each monument came into care, the majority of cases, urgent action needed to be taken to arrest further decay. In simple terms, the Office of Works usually followed and developed a three-staged approach. Firstly, the removal of the often invasive vegetation, including rampant ivy that was causing so much damage. The next stage, as here at Rifo Abbey, the next stage was the excavation, general clearance of deposits and structures thought to post-date the abandonment of monuments, often with minimum recording. And the final stage was the conservation, consolidation and landscaping. Alongside this philosophy was a complete abhorrence of reconstruction, which was considered misleading and unethical. Perhaps a reaction to the Gothic reconstructions of Walaluduc and others elsewhere in Europe, but of course also evidenced here in Wales by Bute and Burgess at Castellcoch and at Cardiff Castle. The principal focus was to arrest the decay of monuments and to avoid anything considered to be restoration. But in reality, decisions were often far more pragmatic. For example, at Tintern Abbey, the major repair of the collapsing south nave of the Abbey Church in the 1920s involved strengthening the structure with steel girder frames set within the stonework. Piers and Baines believed their intervention at Tintern would last another 50 years, but today, exactly 100 years later, we're also facing conservation challenges at Tintern. The treatment and presentation of the surrounding defences was also highly interventionist and belied the keeper's found principle, with defences often restored and moats reflooded, such as at Beaumaris, and later still in the 1950s and 60s at Caerphilly. Of critical importance was the revealing and laying out of the defining period of the monument's history or story, generally the immediate years after its original construction. The result is often described as the Ministry of Works style, a ruined but conserved structure standing alone in a sea of neatly mown grass, gravel paths and tree planting. By presenting the remains in this way, it was believed they could become intelligible, they could be read like a manuscript. Although it's also been suggested that the monument effectively became a dead structure, the equivalent of a museum exhibit. So in summary, there was an aesthetic and intellectual shift from viewing the sites as romantic, ivy-clad but decaying ruins to intelligible, instructive but secure monuments. Ivy no longer contributed to the charm and picturesque character of the monument, but was seen as an odious and damaging plant that could no longer be tolerated. The presentation, was in so many ways a deception. For example, the neat ordered presentation contrasted with the medieval reality. Only elements of the original structures could be presented, although the timber buildings, for example, had long since gone. Only one phase of the monument could be effectively presented, with later phases often completely ignored. And the surrounding landscape context was often disregarded. Nevertheless, despite the criticism, the Office of Works effectively saved the monuments and made them accessible and intelligible. They began a process that was to result in an extraordinary national collection that is rightly considered one of our great treasures. Now, in the second part, I'm going to talk about the late 20th century and the philosophical change and new approaches. Until the 1970s, successive inspectors of ancient monuments for Wales worked from London. By the late 1970s, a full transfer of staff and functions had taken place, with a team working on the Welsh monuments moving to offices in Cardiff. Soon after, a decision was taken to retain the Welsh Historic Environment Service within the Welsh Office, and Cadw, Welsh Historic Monuments, was born on October the 29th, 1984. Practically exactly 40 years ago to this day. In contrast to the creation of an arm's length body, English Heritage, for example, in English Heritage Across the Border, there were three principal drivers for change which I believe took place during the course of the late 20th century. Changes were more than administrative. We can see a fundamental shift in approach to the presentation of the sites in state care, driven by three significant developments. The first was an increasing recognition of the economic value of heritage, in particular through tourism. This has grown throughout the 20th century, and in particular followed the widespread ownership of the motor car. And it was no accident that it was a landmark report on the opportunities the historic monuments of Wales could make to tourism that directly led to the establishment of Cadw in 1984. The second has been the gradual wider shift in heritage conservation theory and practice away from the long accepted or authorised approach on authenticity and fabric. During the latter part of the 20th century, this has been gradually replaced by an emphasis on heritage values and significance, including the value of heritage to the wider community or society. The third driver for change in Wales has been an increasing recognition of the contribution that heritage can make to national self-identity. This took on heightened momentum following the devolution settlement at the turn of the century. So I'm going to consider these in turn before reflecting on the impact that they've had on the way in which the monuments of Wales are presented. Heritage tourism, a key driver that led to the establishment of Cadw in 1984 was the recommendations from this report, the Brown Report, including a new approach to the presentation of monuments in Wales to make them more enjoyable, more enlightening, more profitable, without detracting from their historic value or cultural value. At the time of the Brown Report, priorities very much focused on the protection and preservation of the fabric of the monuments rather than their commercial potential. Brown did not hold back on his damning assessment of the declining commercial performance of the Welsh monuments, citing a serious downward trend in admission figures, poor retail performance, lack of investment, dull presentation, poor facilities and signposting, inadequate marketing, and many other failings. He summarised by saying that but they're all in serious decline and show signs of continuing. Following the publication of the report, the team that comprised the Ancient Monuments Department, including the inspectors, architects, skills craftsmen and custodians, were joined by a commercially focused team seconded from the Wales Tourist Board to form Cadw. There is no doubt that tensions quickly emerged. And to some extent, these still exist. On the one side, there was the feeling that the new commercial team failed to appreciate or understand the legislative framework and the principles of philosophy that lay behind the conservation and historic presentation of the sites. But on the other hand, the commercial team felt that unnecessary barriers were being put in the way to prevent the new organisation becoming financially viable. New approaches were not valued. The referees were the first two Cadw chief executives, John Carr and Tom Cassidy. The second driver for change in the approach to presentation was the fundamental shift that began to emerge in the approach to conservation during the later part of the 20th century. This was linked to a reassessment of the meaning of significance, which had its origins in the United States, America and Australia. The old philosophy, centering around the supremacy of the fabric, was being challenged by a new model that, in the words of another former chief executive, Tate Clark, heritage is multivocal, contested and difficult. What has become known as the authorised heritage discourse that stressed the role of archaeological expertise and a collection of unchanging heritage assets that are inherited and passed on to unchanged to future generations. One of the first documents to challenge this orthodoxy was the Australian ICOMOS Charter, also known as the Borough Charter. This introduced the concept that cultural significance of a place was the sum of its values, and that place can be social as well as historic, aesthetic and scientific. Process of clearly articulating a statement of significance through a full understanding of all its heritage values and against which the impact of interventions can be measured now sits at the core of our conservation thinking. In Wales, this has been set out in Conservation Principles that was published in 2011. One of the challenges is that the social or communal values, its value to people who interact with the monument, is not easy to assess, not always tangible, and they can be tied up in identity, memory and belonging, can be subjective and difficult to measure. At the centre of the new approach has been an understanding of the impact of a proposal on significance. For example, a misplaced car park or a poorly considered and designed visit centre can significantly diminish the very thing that they are there to support. The significance of the historic place itself. Cadw has now published guidance on how to approach this to facilitate a much more consistent and carefully considered approach to decision making. Finally, the third driver for change in Wales was linked to the re-emergence of a sense of national self-identity, a sense of Welshness, if you like, an identification of Welsh cultural significance, and the need to consider the values associated with identity took on a new momentum with political devolution and the establishment of the Welsh Assembly in 1999. It's perhaps inevitable that heritage provides a rich seam which could be cultivated and utilised. Following devolution, Cadw was to return to central government in July 2005, but this time as a directorate of the Welsh Government, and there it has remained despite a number of governance reviews. A new director for Cadw, Marilyn Lewis, was appointed, who brought a new people-focused approach, challenging the more conservative approach that was still prevalent. She was determined to put people back at the centre of Cadw monuments, very much in line with the values-based approach, but also with an emphasis on the new confidence that was emerging in Wales as a nation. An example was the significant investment in the conservation and presentation of non-Cadw monuments associated with Welsh cultural history, and in particular the native Welsh princes in Owain Glyndŵr. Alongside this, there's been a notable divergence in legislation and policy here in Wales, for example, new legislation. Perhaps the reassertion of Welsh identity has most prominently played out in Cadw's acquisition policy. Monuments over the last 40 years have included those directly associated with Welsh cultural history. For example, the castles and courts of native Welsh princes at Dynefwr and Dryslwyn in 1980s, and more recently Caergwrle and Llysrosser in recent years. Moving on to some case studies, just to reflect on the way in which these drivers have impacted upon what we can see today in which we present sites. For example, the need to reflect on social and communal values and tourism opportunities has driven new physical interventions supporting physical access, including improvements to support those with mobility challenges, and intellectual access with new approaches to on-site interpretation. In all cases, a balance has had to be made between evidential and aesthetic values, including fabric. However, compromise has always been required, and the solutions have often been innovative and imaginative. So looking at some examples of approaches to physical access, practical debates still continued over whether new interventions should use materials that were sympathetic to what was perceived to be the original appearance of the monument, once again risking a deception, or was the preference for the use of modern materials that could not be mistaken for historic fabric. For example, a steel staircase that was inserted into the towers at Rhuddlan, actually that was led by Siân Rhys, and more recently at Flint, to allow safe public access to appreciate the view from the top and upper wall walks, and these cannot be mistaken, of course, for anything other than modern. Similarly, a new roof using modern materials has been placed over the Martin's Tower at Chepstow Castle. And safety barriers, the design of introduction, facilitating safe access, especially to the upper areas of monuments, has frequently been a challenge. For example, it's only recently that a satisfactory solution has been found for the upper wall walks at Harlech, which has just been put in just last year. In these examples, great efforts have been made to minimise direct impact on the historic fabric and to minimise the visual impact of the new interventions from outside of the buildings. However, no attempt has been made to hide the obvious modern nature of these interventions. By contrast, the restoration of the grand staircase leading to the apartments and top of the nearby battlements at Raglan Castle is not obviously a modern repair. It provides improved public access, including to a viewing platform on the battlements with views across the former water gardens. And similarly, even more interventionist was the conservation and complete refitting of the Tudor townhouse at Plas Mawr in Conwy, which was rescued from near collapse following its acquisition by Cadw in 1993. A similar approach, perhaps on a smaller scale, was undertaken in 2010 with the introduction of new floors and partitions, decoration and room dressings in the West Range at Tretower Court. It's actually no accident that several of these interventions, including those at Plas Mawr, Martin's Tower, Raglan, were led by Rick Turner, who was prepared to push the boundaries of conservation orthodoxy, but nevertheless all with a comprehensive consideration and assessment of the heritage impact of the work. Other examples of Turner's approach to conservation intervention was the replacement of sculpted dressed stone at St David's Bishop's Palace at Raglan Castle and at Chepstow Castle, with the skilled support of Cadw's in-house team of banker stonemasons. But nowhere has this challenging approach to physical intervention been more pronounced in the changing style and design of access bridges. The accepted approach has always been to use traditional materials, notably oak, for access bridges, such as those at Caerphilly, Beaumaris and Carrickenen here. However, for 2 decades, two of the most popular Cadw sites, the World Heritage Site castles at Harlech and Caernarfon, were almost completely inaccessible to any visitors with mobility challenges without significant physical assistance. The first to be tackled was Caernarfon, with the construction of a highly visual and unmistakably modern steel and timber structure that sits tight against the curtain wall. Perhaps emboldened by the Caernarfon experience, an even more striking and interventionist approach was taken into Castell Harlech, transforming access into the castle. And at Caernarfon, this drive to improve access for those with mobility challenges has literally been taken to the next level, with the glass lift inserted into the west turret of the King's Gate at Caernarfon, facilitating access to a new viewing platform at an upper level. The post-1984 approach to visitor centres has been very much about well-designed, modern-looking buildings with an emphasis on timber and glass, such as at Caerphilly and Denbigh. At Raglan, the architects have gone one step further by integrating the new build into the existing fabric, here in the top right-hand photograph. All three drivers for change have also had a dramatic impact on intellectual access and on-site interpretation. Since the creation of Cadw, a more inclusive approach has emerged that recognises that sites are texts with multiple stories that can be read in many ways. Perhaps the most visible change was a shift from monuments being kind of dead displays to being actively used by communities for public events and even ceremonies such as weddings. The key word here is relevance, a realisation that the traditional Ministry of Work style meant that significant elements of the population felt excluded, that the presentation only catered for an elite. Some felt that it could only appeal to a minority who could read the fabric or the document as presented. The original ministry style to on-site signage, for example, was just simple signs announcing the function of a particular building, the Great Hall or the kitchen, often using terms that were not familiar to the majority of visitors. Here at the top right-hand side, Knight Stair to Daughter at at Neath Abbey. There's often even evidence that visits from those who allegedly lacked interest or understanding of the monuments were actively discouraged because they might cause damage or disfigurement. The new approach needed to demonstrate a more democratic and inclusive approach. The traditional monolingual and simple signs were replaced by informative and illustrated interpretation panels, often with artists' impressions, increasingly supplemented with audio tours and digital displays, and displays that can tell the wider stories of the past. For example, the stories of women and children and all parts of the wider community that lived in or under the shadow of the monuments. Similarly, guidebooks witnessed a rapid change. Oh, sorry, I'm just looking at these multiple stories. This is the Queen Eleanor exhibition in the Eagle Tower in Carnarvon Castle. Guidebooks witnessed a similar transformation following the establishment of Cadw. Gone were the old-style blue guides, replaced by full-colour illustrated guides. These combined easy-to-use fold-out plans to support the visit, alongside more detailed text allowing the reader to use the guide as a take-home souvenir. Perhaps the most visible manifestation of change has been the introduction of public art and its use as a medium for conveying key messages and themes in an innovative, engaging and thoughtful way. In some cases, these have been individual standalone sculptures. Examples include the statue of the fourth Marquess of Bute holding up the leaning southeast tower at Caerphilly Castle, a metaphor for his conservation and restoration work undertaking during the 1920s and 30s, or the wickerwork statues of William Marshall and Princess Ernest at Castell Cadw. At Conway, a number of artworks were introduced in various media, including the resting timber guard alongside the guard room in the outer ward, the subject of countless selfies. The need to replace security gateways provides an opportunity to incorporate well-designed art-based interpretation, supporting a sense of arrival. Here at St David's Bishop's Palace in the top slide, at Castel San Steffan in the central one, and at Caerphilly Castle in the lower right slide. Perhaps inevitably, some proposals for art installations have met with controversy. In 2017, a proposal to install a sculpture at Castell Flint was met by widespread opposition. The sculpture was intended to symbolise the surrender of the English crown to Henry IV at the castle in 1399, a moment in history commemorated in Shakespeare's Richard II. However, to many it spoke of the many castles built by Edward I to consolidate his conquest of Wales, often referred to as the Ring of Iron, and a campaign was launched resulting in the project being cancelled. If art was intended to generate debate and engagement with history, well then on this level the proposed installation was successful. Perhaps the most ambitious project to date has been the suite of artwork installed as part of the major investment at the King's Gate at Castell Caernarfon, using the theme "The Hands That Built the Castle," intended to spotlight all of those who contributed to the phenomenal feat of military engineering that the castle represents. Following the Flint experience, every effort was made to discuss the concept at various stages with academics and members of the community, including school children. In the Guardian article on the King's Gate project, the then Cadw chair, Jane Richardson, suggests that there is a sense of Wales wanting to be able to tell its own stories. Edward I is just one of those stories, but not the dominant one for the people who live here. That rebalancing is important. So looking forward to the future, I suspect that we are now seeing yet another shift in our approach that will be driven by three new drivers for change: public expectations, including health and safety, along with the climate and nature emergencies. Happily, there's no tailing off of the number of visitors who come to Cadw monuments. However, ongoing insight work into the composition and nature of our audience suggests that it has not changed for decades, and a formal audience development plan is now being prepared by Cadw. There's also an increasing expectation that we manage risk to visitors and ensure public safety. AI, artificial intelligence, and digital advances, and of course the whole world of technology is changing. There are ongoing expectations of new approaches to interpretation. Secondly, promoting net zero and adapting to a changing climate when all the predictions are indicating warmer and wetter winters and hotter, drier summers, or you wouldn't think about that from this particular summer that's just passed. But there is a greater likelihood of extreme weather events. We're certainly witnessing the results of these changes already, and they can only get worse. For example, the sheer amount of rain that's now falling, for example, earlier this year between January and April, is causing significant damage. Interior decoration at Castle Cork is leading to Cadw having to spend significant amounts of money on addressing the problem at this and other sites. At Tintern and Chepstow castles, Tintern Abbey and Chepstow Castle, the spawning of face stone, and at other sites as well, is also getting worse, which means we have to close off areas to the public and plan for major conservation programs. We may have to consider radical solutions, perhaps netting, or perhaps even re-rendering where there is evidence for that in the past. In terms of biodiversity and nature recovery, while that traditional Ministry of Work style is not always compatible with the encouragement of wildlife, as a public body, Cadw has a duty to address the challenges that we face through the loss of habitat and the nature emergency. For example, Cadw is currently exploring options for new approaches to grounds maintenance and management, encouraging the development of meadows and other habitats for particular species, encouraging wild flowers and colour. This does not mean a return to benign neglect, but a very considered and controlled management regime. Management plans have now been developed for the three castles of Monmouthshire, for example, and this requires consultation with habitat experts, working with interest groups such as wildlife trusts, and also learning from experience elsewhere, such as at Wigmore Castle in Herefordshire. So where are we now? In the past, inspectors have historically been very much schooled in the Ministry of Work's approach, itself drawing upon the supremacy of the fabric. But since the formation of Cadw, there's been increasing recognition of the need to embrace a different intellectual rationale, one that puts significance and heritage values at the heart of decision making and people at the centre of the monuments. But people need new and improved facilities. They expect someone to park their car, to sit and have a coffee. They expect clean and accessible toilets. They need new, embracing and innovative ways of telling the many and varied stories of the past. But above all, they expect to have a positive and enjoyable day out with their family. We also still face an uncertain future, in particular ongoing financial challenges and the extreme challenges that climate change will bring. The influence and work of the Office of Works, documented here by Simon Thurley in The Men from the Ministry, was profound. They brought key monuments into care. They secured their conservation and presentation to the public. But a new approach is now firmly embedded in our practice. It's very useful to read the book by Keith Emmerich, which articulates that new democratic and inclusive way that approaches to heritage that have taken place over the last 30, 40 years. We've travelled a very long way from these early 20th century ambitions of Piers and Baines and Co. Social inclusion and identity are very much now part of the current objectives of the Welsh Government. As Cadw officials, we sit alongside colleagues who are driving the Welsh Minister's ambitions for equality, human rights and community cohesion. Heritage has a huge role to play, as recently demonstrated by the positive response to the chapter on culture and heritage in the Anti-Racist Wales Action Plan. Through the presentation of our great medieval monuments, we can help develop the narrative that will reclaim the extraordinary story of Wales for all of the people of Wales. Thank you very much.